As you may know, the history of this film, during the making of Man on the Moon, the tremendous Milos Forman film about Andy Kaufman, there was a camera crew following Jim Carrey around. That footage was never seen for reasons that will be described in the film. Spike Jonze heard about this footage, convinced people who had it to give it up, put it in the hands of Chris Smith, and what wonderful hands for it to be put into. It is our great pleasure to have him with us here today. Please welcome Chris Smith.
Hello, thanks for coming. I'll keep this brief, but there's a lot of interesting stories and things around the film, which if you stay after, we can dive into. It's funny, I've the last few movies I've done have all led to these theatrical releases, and I just realized tonight at dinner before here that this was the second to last screening, other than it premieres on Netflix next Friday, the 17th. So it's very strange that it's actually very rare that you'll see this, that you'll be a very rare group that have seen this in an audience. I mean, in a theater. So it's exciting. It's been fun. We premiered at Venice in Italy, I think in September, August, September, then went to Toronto, courtesy of Tom. And then just have shown it a few other places. But it's been really fun, and it's been really fun watching it with groups. So I hope you enjoy it. It's been a real privilege and a pleasure spending a year in the lives of Jim and Andy. They're just, it's funny how you just forget their body of work, the impact it's had, and sort of how fun and creative and adventurous and groundbreaking their work really was. And it was really so special to sort of really dive back into that and talk to Jim about it. So I hope you enjoy it, and I'll be here afterwards if you have any questions.
It is Jim and Andy, The Great Beyond. So Chris, when we showed the film at the Toronto Film Festival, I remember Spike Jonze saying that he had heard about this footage and that he had been trying to get his hands on it to use for something. What was that process like to actually get your hands on the footage?
So yeah, I got a call about a year and a half ago from Spike just saying that there had been this 100 hours of footage that had been locked away for 18 years. And I don't think it was purposely left. It was just everyone was busy, and it just sort of got overlooked. And so Spike had finally got to see some of it, and he saw the Lawler stuff with the sign on his back and the wrestling scene and stuff, and just was like, oh, I think there could be something here. So he got Jim to finally give over the footage, which was I think a year-long process. And then once we got it, we spent about 6 months going through all the material and cutting it down to about 3.5 hours. And then from there, I think it was December 28th of 2016, I just got a phone call. It was like, Jim can shoot on January 7th, because we hadn't heard anything for months. And it was just a week later, and so I was like, all right, oh, sure. So we went to Jim's house. I want to shoot him at a soundstage, and they said, he probably won't show up. Because I thought it would be a good thematic thing, to tie in. They're like, I think if you do it at his house, you have a much better chance of him being there. So we went and did it. It was really interesting because when they gave us the footage, I think the only expectation, when they came to me, they said it might be a half-hour, an hour-long TV show for Vice Guide to Film. We don't know what it is. Why don't you just you can play with it and see what comes of it. And so originally, I think everyone thought that I would do interviews with Danny and Paul Giamatti and Milos Forman and Jim and everyone and try to make this movie about this crazy experience or incident that happened. But my fear right away was just that it would turn out to be like a glorified DVD extra, and that it would sort of reduce the movie to being this one sort of very isolated, not very interesting story. I mean, so I felt like by talking to Jim and really sort of looking at an exploration of his career, his life, Andy's life, this incident, and sort of how it affected him going forward, had a much better chance of being something that could go beyond just like a retelling of this one thing. So
Now, before this project, what was your experience of Andy Kaufman? How much had he made an impression on you?
Oddly enough, a friend of mine in high school was obsessed with Andy Kaufman, so we would watch his stuff. And I always remember thinking there was this VHS tape we had, and I was like, this would have been a great documentary to have made. And so I was like really like bummed out that I didn't get to it first, even though I was like 18 years old. And then it was just ironic that it sort of came back. But I was always a huge fan, as so many people were, that just had been exposed to him just because it was so different. And it's funny looking at this stuff now. I think you don't realize, like, when you think of when he was doing these things and working at a diner one day a week, and just very odd behavior. Where wrestling wasn't cool, there wasn't a lot of money in it. It was like he was very much, I think, like exploring and pushing things in a way that was so advanced for the time.
We can take some questions.
I have one thing I forgot. So the title of the movie is Jim and Andy: The Great Beyond, featuring a very special, contractually obligated mention of Tony Clifton. So the title used to be longer, actually. It had another sentence in it, and then it was reduced because on Netflix they couldn't fit it in the box. But the reason that the title was that we had shot the movie, we cut the movie, and Brendan, one of the producers, was going to Bob Zamuta's house to get weird footage of Andy Kaufman, like him on playing the piano, like things that we were just trying to look for, things that weren't on YouTube and that people might not have seen. So we were going through footage. So he was there for the weekend and showed them a cut of the movie, and then they were like, "So you need to license the footage for the film." And Brendan was like, "I don't know what you're talking about. We made a deal with Jim." And somehow Jim's office had the footage and thought that they owned the footage. So we made a deal, and like we worked on the movie, we cover here. And then, so Brendan called, and Jim's person was like, Bob Zamuda thinks that they own the footage. And she's like, "No, it's 100% inaccurate. Let me get back to you in a second." Call back like an hour later, like, "Yeah, they own the footage." So we cut and shot an entire movie without owning any of the footage in it. And then it was only till then. So in Bob's deal, in terms of licensing the footage, was if Jim and Andy were in the title, then Tony had to be in the title. So he originally wanted the title to be Jim, Andy, and Tony, but we kind of liked Jim and Andy. So then we compromised by making this title that we thought Andy would like, which is explicitly just saying that it was contractually obligated, which is how we ended up with that title.
You're lucky some distributor didn't try and change the title to Andy and Jim so that it would show up higher in alphabetical listing.
That would have been fine. It just didn't ring as well.
Of course. We can take some questions from the audience. We have a microphone that we can bring to you. We have two microphones. Raise your hand. I see a hand up over here. Bring that gentleman.
I'm just curious. Was there footage of Andy's daughter that you purposely left out, or was that never filmed?
That was never filmed. We would have, of course, used it unless it felt bad. But no, it was never filmed. One thing I will say, though, while we were at Toronto, Lynn and Bob actually came to the screening, and it was really great. We had them at a Q&A, and it just literally, Jim was on stage and Lynn was in the audience, and literally I think almost all the questions, I don't know if you were at that one, went to Lynn, because everyone was so fascinated, and she was telling Andy stories, and she said her and Andy lived together and they had a roommate, and one day the roommate made a remark to Lynn that Andy used a lot of toilet paper. And so she just said, as an example of what Andy was like, she said every day he would come home, he'd bring another roll of toilet paper with him and just stack it behind the toilet, and said until the whole wall eventually was just filled with toilet paper, and was never mentioned by anyone in the house. So yeah, it was really fun spending time with them and just hearing all the stories of things that you haven't heard before.
Now, the screening that I hosted with you in Toronto, Tony Clifton was in the audience, and we spent the time on stage wondering if there was going to be some kind of disruption, but
yeah,
he behaved himself.
Yeah, but he did bring a prostitute with him from the Mustang Ranch.
I see a microphone over here. Yep, go. I'll get you in a second.
Thank you so much. This was really great. I'm mixed between emotions of existential crisis and not taking things too seriously. Between Truman Show, Eternal Sunshine, American Movie even, and this, there are so many shows within a show going on. Maybe this is too personal, but what do you have a life philosophy, and do you kind of feel like Jim did at the end in terms of talking about existence and that sort of thing?
That's a deep question. I think I would say It's funny because I feel like the movie is very much a Rorschach test, and it's like a mirror onto to everyone that sees it. And some people take away different things. Some people just is what it is. But for me, when I worked on it, it became very quickly clear that it felt like, we all are working, or not all of us, but a lot of people I know are working towards some goal that we think when we get there, then we'll be able to rest and be happy. And I felt like the message of the movie, or at least what I took away from it, was you have somebody that had sort of gone to the other side of the mountain and is coming back and saying there's nothing there. And what I mean by that is just that Jim sort of had these goals that you can see him clearly outlined when he's like 18 years old, and he achieved everything he could ever want and was still unhappy. And so I felt like the message of the movie was to sort of really think hard and reevaluate the goals that you're setting for yourself, because they may not, when you get there, it might not be as satisfying or what you think it is. And so that, to me, was sort of what I took away from this. I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah.
Okay, bring a microphone to this gentleman with his hand up on.
Hello? More or less, first question, and the question is, how did you come up with the triple biodocumentary? Second question is, did you ask Milosh about the screenplay that he didn't never make? I did. It's my question.
I'm not sure. The first question was, how do people buy a documentary?
No. How did you come up with a triple bio documentary?
Oh, a triple bio documentary. How did he come up with doing a triple bio documentary?
I didn't come up with it. Someone asked me to make the movie. So. But it was, I mean, it was all there just because Jim, I mean, it's interesting how they both sort of lives intersected in this way that felt very meaningful, yet they had never met, yet Jim was inhabited by Andy. So, I mean, I think it was very much inherent to the material that we were working with.
What was anytime we see a film finished, it feels like, oh, of course, that's the way the film was going to get made. But in the course of it, there's all kinds of decisions made and maybe, paths that you think you're going down. I mean, you described one path that had been presented of, oh, maybe we interview all the characters and you chose not. What was the process of getting to where the movie is now?
Yeah, I mean, there are many bad versions of any movie. I hope this one worked. I liked it. But we had a version once where we had chapter headings, and we were like, oh, we'll tell the story in these chapters. And we went to days, so we marked out each of the days that happened. I actually did 2 interviews with Jim. And in the second interview, we did another 4 hours, which only about 10 minutes ended up in the movie, if that. And it was really interesting because the first interview was much more focused on the making of Man on the Moon, but also Jim's sort of these tangents that we went into these different places. But the second interview ended up being much more biographical and about him and his life. And it was interesting when we got the footage back, we actually just cut it all in thinking it would work. And it ended up being having like 2 different movies in one and they actually worked really poorly together, because the more that we added about Jim's personal life, it started to become, oh, when you were in that movie, it was really interesting, but then going back to this movie, it was not very interesting. Then you'd settle into this one, and then it was weird to go out of it and go into the other. So we added some biographical elements of Jim, very 2 brief sections, but there was so much more, and it was really fascinating and really interesting. But it was interesting because I didn't realize it at the time until we cut it in, that it was really not working well together.
I see a hand up over here. We'll get you a microphone.
Also, my biggest fear in life is being stuck in a Q&A, so if anyone wants to leave, you can, and I won't be offended. I always leave before just for that reason, so you can get up, and no one will judge you. Okay.
I'm curious, what was the thought process in keeping Carnegie Hall in the wrong chronology? It happened in 1979, not 1983.
Yeah, we followed the trajectory of the movie. That was a decision that was made in the construction of Man on the Moon, so we just sort of followed that storyline for for ours, because I think actually the people that made that movie have sort of rewritten history, and I know that happens often in narrative films, but I think it was just more of a, I think they did it for an emotional sort of journey that the audience would go on in terms of, I would assume, I haven't asked Milos. Milos saw the movie and wrote a letter that he loved it, but I haven't talked to him personally, so that would be more of a question for you know, for the narrative film. We just sort of followed that trajectory in terms of our timeline as well.
Okay, yeah, we have time for one or two more questions. And then, of course, all the people who want to leave, you can. This woman right here with her hand up.
Thanks for the question. I thought it was interesting that you added the snippet about the REM video and decision not to participate in the video as in character as Andy. Can you talk about what it was like for him coming out of character, progressing from being in that role? That I thought would be an interesting.
Well, I think like it was interesting because Michael Stipe produced my film and Spike Jonze movie in 1999, and I remember visiting him while he was recording this song and doing the music video for it, and I remember that they were really unhappy that he didn't, you know, wouldn't go back into character for the music video, and so the video is them all waiting for Jim to show up as Andy, and he never shows up. But it was funny because it at the time it didn't seem like a big deal. Like, why would it be such a big issue to just sort of get dressed up again and be in the video? But I felt like just seeing this movie, it was very clear like that it wasn't just as easy as like dressing back up as the character. It was really, it was something else. And then until we got into this, I actually had floated the idea of like doing interviews with Andy and Tony Clifton older, and kind of mixing the interviews of all three of them, like looking back. And then but then once we got into the footage, realized that was a terrible idea, and that it was not the same reason that he wouldn't do the REM video. That would make sense that he wouldn't want to go do that. But that was one of the original ideas I had that I thought could be interesting, and I talked to Jim about it. It was definitely not going to happen.
Okay, we can take one more question. Anyone over here? Or okay, I'll do this aisle. This person here. This person is conceding his question to you, so take it. Oh, no. That gentleman in the aisle said that this gentleman here could take the question. Put your hand up, and yes, we'll get you a microphone. I think we need to recharge your battery on the microphone. Now you can definitely leave if this is too much for you.
You lived with this footage for a long time, and I was wondering, do you think Jim would have acted the way he did if there wasn't a camera crew filming him all the time backstage?
I think so. I don't feel like it was for the camera because they only filmed a fraction of what was happening, and he was in character the whole time. I mean, if you look at the amount of footage we have, there was so much else happening. What I found most interesting in looking through it all was just that Jim's off-camera persona was actually a version of Andy's on-camera persona. Like when Jerry Lawler says it in the footage, but a lot of people commented that Andy, when he wasn't on camera, was very polite and mild-mannered and calm. And I feel like if you really look, you don't notice it at first, so it took a while to realize, but Jim's kind of off-camera persona was really, it felt like Andy's on-camera one. He was always on. And so it was a little bit of a different thing. And again, there are definite downtimes in terms of the material that, if you look at the breadth of the material, there's a lot of stuff where he is like that, but it's interesting that a lot of his off-camera persona was really amped up, you know, in terms of not being in the movie. So it was an interesting sort of weird hybrid of trying to figure out what was what, but it was, I don't know, I think for him it felt right, you know, which is I guess all that mattered.
Well, as we said before, you're one of the first audiences in the world to see Jim and Andy. It'll come out on Netflix next Friday, November 17th, and you're one of the last audiences to see it on a big screen until we do a Chris Smith retrospective in years to come. Thank you very much for coming. Thanks especially to Chris Smith.